The physical world we perceive is not the actual reality, but rather a user interface created by consciousness to interact with something deeper and more complex.
Where do we start with Hoffman?
Yeah, so where I went first was kind of a fun thought experiment that talks about the accuracy of our perception of reality. So I would believe that most people haven't given a whole lot of thought to if they perceive reality accurately. They just take for granted the assumption that their senses belie truthful information to them. Right? I mean, I think most of us kind of operate that way.
Well, it's their truth.
Sure. and that could be. That's kind of funny because, we want to talk about absolute truth.
Yeah.
But most of the absolute truths I'm finding are metaphysical in nature. They're not bound by space-time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, here's kind of an interesting thought exercise to go through. Okay. So like Hoffman's view of consciousness is fundamental, particularly in his theory of conscious realism, suggests that the physical world we perceive is not the actual reality, but rather a user interface created by consciousness to interact with something deeper and more complex. According to Hoffman, consciousness is the primary aspect of reality, and what we experience as the physical world is a construct of conscious agents interacting. Now, give you an example of this, okay? A computer screen. When you interact with your computer, let's say that you want to open a file. The file on your desktop is presented as a little blue folder, right, in the top right-hand corner, where when you click it, it opens and you can view the contents of that file. But in reality, does that folder, that blue folder, exist in the computer? It doesn't. That's a simplified graphical interface of what's actually happening in the reality of the computer. But when we interface with the computer, we don't think about the truth of what's actually going on in the computer. In fact, we don't really even comprehend the truth of that.
Yeah.
Because if that's how we functioned when we used a computer, because what's actually happening in that computer when we do that? Well, there's varying voltages moving across circuitry in a circuit board with, switches moving on and off, and there's zeros and ones in code that's right. But we don't actually deal in the truth of the situation. We see reality as like a simplified avatar of the actual truth of what's functioning. And so that's the argument that Hoffman makes. He says, our perception does not reflect the true nature of reality. We don't see the zeros and ones. We don't see the movement of electrical current, the circuit board functioning, none of that. Instead, they serve as a simplified user interface similar to the desktop icons on a computer, designed by evolution to help us survive and reproduce. Just as icons on a desktop do not reveal the inner workings of the computer, our perceptions do not reveal the true structure of reality. They only show us what we need to know to interact effectively with the world. So you think about that, even like in our interaction here. We view each other as like this simplified avatar, that I know as Tyler. And that's made up of a few things like our interactions together, my understanding of maybe your thought processes in different areas, the images of your face and some of those things. But the reality of Tyler is so much deeper than that, right? In our previous episode, in talking about the makeup of the human body, I mean, you can extrapolate into these just extremely complex and almost, incomprehensible levels of detail or truth inside of how the human body functions. But we don't view reality in that way. We take everything at like a simplified face value so that we can interact with it in a way in which it enables us to essentially live our lives and survive in a simplistic manner. So this understanding now that our perception of reality is not truth, it's a simplified version of interacting that over time, say Darwinian evolution or natural selection has essentially given us so that we can interact in what they call fitness ways, right? Truth versus fitness, which we'll get into a little later. But it's fitness that is ideal for survival, not truth.
Mm-hmm.
And so then that lends us to be able to question some of the ideas we have about the physical universe. What is truth? Where does it come from? Right? Does it come from physical interaction or our physical senses? I believe that truth is a lot deeper than that.
Yeah.
That most absolute truth is metaphysical in nature. May be able to be modeled mathematically, but does not come from space and time as we might think. Right? So that desktop interface analogy, I think, is an interesting one. Hoffman discusses how objects in our everyday experience, like a red apple, appear to us solid, colored, and tangible. However, science tells us that the apple is mostly empty space, with atoms and subatomic particles making up its structure. Our perception of the apple as a solid object with a specific color is a useful interface, not an accurate reflection of its true nature.
Mm.
The red color of the apple is not an intrinsic property of the apple itself, but a product of how our brain processes light waves reflecting off the apple. The solidity we perceive is an illusion created by the forces between atoms. The true structure of the apple, its quantum mechanical reality, is invisible to us because our perception is focused on what's useful for our survival, not on the deeper, more complex reality.
Mm. It's almost like you could call that. So this is called the invisibility of true structure.
Yep.
But you could almost call this reality versus usefulness,
Yes.
right?
Truth. They call it truth versus fitness.
Yeah.
So a fitness criteria is essentially like a genetic adaptation that we have that is designed to help us survive versus the truth of the situation. And so over time, we have really been modified for survival, not for truth.